Okay, guys, big news. At least it is for me, and I hope it will be for you. It's time to talk about the subject of my new book, How to Get Hitched and Stay Hitched, a 12-step program for marriage-minded women. And hang tight before you forward through this because the book may not be exactly what you think it is. Let's face it, folks, America is single. It's divorced, undercommitted, and hopelessly out of touch with how to build a relationship that lasts. Women in particular are groomed for a life centered on career and on being fiercely independent, as though marriage and family were a nice idea or a possible accompaniment to an otherwise satisfying life. But if flying solo is so great, why are online dating sites a billion-dollar industry, replete with clients looking to get hitched? In How to Get Hitched, I provide women with the detox they need from the 4 lies the culture tells. Here are those 4 lies. Number 1, sex is just sex. Number 2, never depend on a man. Number 3, marriage plus motherhood equals jail. Number 4, career success will and should define you. If you're a woman who wants a happy marriage and a balanced life, you are going to need a whole new roadmap. And now you have one. In this 12-step program, you will learn why your 20s matter and how to make the most of these years, how to date with purpose and a plan, why living with a man to whom you're not engaged is a massive mistake, facts about your fertility no one will tell you, why love alone is no reason to get married, and a brand new way to balance work and family. A call to arms, How to Get Hitched, will ignite a much-needed debate about the misplaced priorities of the modern generation. The superwoman ideal with which women have been raised is not sustainable in real life. Women can, however, have most of what they want if they pursue it in piecemeal fashion and in the right order. How to Get Hitched is available now at Amazon for pre-order, including the audio version, which was read by yours truly. The book will officially be available on August 31st, and you can read all about it at howtogethitched.net, where you will find a link to our Facebook group page, as well as a link to the actual 12-step program page, which gives a major overview of the 12 steps you'll read about in this book. If you're a woman who feels successful in life but not in love, you are going to want a copy of this book. If you're the parent of a single adult daughter and you want her to have a roadmap for life that doesn't encourage her to wait for marriage and family until the last possible moment, under the guise that there will be a pot of suitable young men waiting for them on the sidelines, which you and I both know there won't be, you will want to buy and give her a copy of this book ASAP. Again, just go to howtogethitched.net and you'll find everything you need to know there. And now, on with the show. From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week when we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. So I was raised in what I choose to call a high conflict household, which it's like anything else. If you compare your upbringing to other people's, you're going to always be able to say it could have been worse and it could have been better, right? Next to a really horrific upbringing, I certainly didn't have one. But compared to a healthy upbringing, it looks different. It's always been really hard for me to talk about this because I feel very beholden and loyal to my parents, because separately, individually, they were great parents and passed on great messages. I mean, I could do a whole podcast on the phenomenal habits I learned from them, how to think about my life, irrespective of what the world around me is doing or what what is the cool thing to do, which we'll come back to that because that has everything to do with why I do what I do. So individually, it was great. Just a lot of good stuff there. Together, not so great. And all of these factors made me who I am, just like whatever factors you had in your upbringing created who you are today. We're all alike in that way. And I see now how I got, where I am and what I'm doing. And people often ask me what drives me and how did I get here and why do I do what I do. So I thought I would take this opportunity to just tell you my story. The earlier years of my childhood were good. My memories of them were good, definitely better earlier on than later. But I had a very unusual family, for at least for those days. Now, I can't speak to, for those days. I was born in 1968, so I grew up largely in the 70s. And then the early 80s, I was a teenager. And my parents married, my mother married late in life by, as I say, those standards. She was 36 when she married my father, who was a divorced man with 4 children. And she had, she was 34 when she got married, and she was 36 when she had my sister and 38 when she had me. So again, not so shocking by today's standards, but definitely back then. She was what you'd call a career woman. Spent a good 15 years in the workforce before ultimately marrying my dad. Both of my parents have MBAs. My father was a CPA with Pricewaterhouse for 44 years. You don't hear that anymore either. With a pension. And my mother was a stockbroker, and they both went to Washington University in St. Louis, and my mother went on to Radcliffe later. That's where she got her MBA, which is at the time was the sister school of Harvard, all female. And she lived in New York and DC and did that whole thing and then came back. That seems to be a common theme in my family for whatever reason. I did that as well, as did my sister and even my cousins. So I don't know. I guess it's a rite of passage to go live life up east and then come back to the Midwest. But at any rate, so she, my mom, and then she was in a very, of course, male-dominated field. She was one of the 3 stockbrokers at the time, and there was a story written up on her in the paper about that. And if you were to read that that article, it would sound like something you'd read today, but it just simply wasn't done then. It talked about her being knee deep in stocks up until she gave birth, and then she went back to work shortly thereafter. But anyway, long story short, she ended up leaving her career after, I guess, 15 years or so in it, when my sister and I were 5 and 3. Yeah. And she was home ever since. And she just, she had, not only did she stay home with us and raise us, but she had many, 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 many interests and activities that were far more typical of those days. Gardening, history, historical preservation was actually her real passion. So alongside raising us, she never did go back to be a stockbroker. She just, she found other things to do. But as a result of that experience that she had that was so unusual for those times, the takeaway for me growing up was very different from my contemporaries, because I knew that your life was whatever you were going to make it, as a person. I didn't think in terms of male and female. You just did what you wanted to do. And the idea of being held back was just not ever on the radar, ever. And my parents were examples of that, and wholly encouraging in whatever my sister and I wanted to do. Oh, actually, my sister might take that back. Take that. She's listening. I'm sure she's listening. I want to get that right. But what separated the messages I got from my mother specifically from what other women might have gotten from their mothers is that there was nothing anti-marriage, anti-male, and there was no pro-empowerment message about needing to make my own way in life and never depend on a man or any of that. That ideology just did not exist in our home. Life was very, very, very practical. They grew up, both my parents, they're members of the greatest generation. So my dad was born in 1922. My mom was born in 1930. Their entire mindset was totally different from any boomer mentality, which, it's funny because at the time, my parents were about 10, maybe even a little bit more, 15 years older than my friends' parents. And of course, that was a big problem for me growing up because nobody wants older parents. You want hip parents, right? So that was problematic between us for a while. But it worked out miraculously well, exceptionally well for me with respect to this other issue. And that is that I didn't get fed a lot of the same stuff that some of my friends did. Or even if they weren't fed that, whatever was coming from the culture regarding feminism and empowerment and not depending on a man and all that stuff, of course, that was starting to come from the culture at the time. But I had this other message coming at me at home, both modeled and expressed in a way that my friends, I do not think did, because their mothers were more typical, stereotypical housewives. My mom's life represented a path that feminists suggests women take, but that's not why she took it. She just did what came naturally for her. And then when she got into it and, why she thought she could raise 2 babies and toddlers alongside being a stockbroker is beyond me, but she did. And she realized the insanity of that. And she stopped and came home and said, that doesn't work. You gotta plan out your life. You gotta expect to be there when they're home. When they're little, when your kids are little, and she always regretted that. So again, very countercultural messages early on. So needless to say, this unusual background that I have has everything to do with why I do what I do and won't surprise you in the least. So I think that just ended up giving me a different perspective. So that's part 1. All good stuff. Worked out really, really well for me. My mom was also, by the way, just really, she loved children. And the needs of children were very paramount for her and passed that on to me as well. Where things got tricky was when we got older and started to have more of a voice. That's where my mom really did not do well with the motherhood experience, because she comes from, I come from a long line of very strong-willed and strong-minded women. And she's a product of her parents, and her parents are a product of their parents, and whatever. I don't know how far back it goes. I only know my parents' dynamic, and then her parents, not so much the parents, but the parenting that went on for my mother and how that affected her. And then it just repeats itself, right? And so, it took me a really long time to understand all of this. But the way it manifested itself at the time was that, she was not comfortable when she was not in control. And discipline was not her strong suit at all. She didn't know how to deal with children who actually don't do what they're told, don't stay in a box, which is what was expected of her as well. And of course, she was very rebellious, which is the irony of the whole thing. All of which is to say, this affected her marriage to my father. It wasn't just a mothering thing. It was also a marriage thing. My father was a very, 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 very stable man. I wouldn't call him an intellectual per se, but he was definitely more nerd-like. He graduated from high school at 17, graduated from college at 21, went right on to get his MBA. He was a great student. He did what he was told. He, like I said, he was at the same company for 44 years. And check this out, not one sick day, not one, which is like, I don't even know what to say to that. So, except to say that my mom wanted steadiness and she got it in spades. And the reason she wanted steadiness was because her family was greatly affected, negatively, obviously, by the Great Depression. Her father lost his job and actually never worked again. Her mother, my grandmother, had a college degree and went to work to support the family at that point when my grandfather was laid off. So the dynamic that she saw as a result of that was, again, very unusual for those days, and repeated in her relationship with my father, which was that she was the dominant one. And what she said went. And my father would try to be heard, and essentially it was a process of trying to be heard, giving up, trying to be heard, giving up. He did not have a strong constitution insofar as inwardly he did, but, he wasn't going to, he didn't want to fight. That's what it comes down to, which, like I've said repeatedly, men don't want to fight with women in general. So I think that's a totally normal, predicament for a husband to be in when they have a very strong-willed and strong-minded wife. It's a fine line that they deal with, because they want you to be happy and they don't like fighting with you, but they also want to lead. And there was no leading. And the leader was my mother, period, end of story. So that, anyway, I'm leading up. I want to go back to my opening, which is to say that I grew up in a high conflict household. So once I got to be a teenager, really both my sister and I were teenagers, it was bad. It was very, very bad, because my parents just did not know. They did not have the discipline thing down at all. So that caused great strife between them. And I actually think that most of the strife between them was parenting related. I imagined them before we came along as being much more peaceful, but I don't know. I just know that parenting together was not their strength. So the takeaway for me growing up was very clear. It was such a sad place at times during those years, let's say from 12 to 18, that I had a very strong response to it, or my response to it, I should say, was that, okay, it was very clear to me that for a family to function in a healthy way, the way it's supposed to function in an ideal way, starts at the top with the marriage. And if the marriage isn't strong, the family can never be strong. That was my takeaway. It was very clear to me, even as an 11-year-old, 10, 11, 12, I'm formulating in my mind all of these things, but it was just obvious. I knew that this wasn't normal or healthy to have this kind of conflict going on. And I swore from the time I was young that I would not have that life for myself. And that in order to avoid it, getting the marriage thing down was crucial, because without it, you have no good family. That's just what it comes down to. It falls apart. The family falls apart if the marriage falls apart. Generally speaking, there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, when the marriage falls apart, the family falls apart. I knew that I wanted to have a family, and I was going to do it the right way. at least to the best of my ability, the right way. And in order to do that, the marriage thing had to be done right. Okay, so fast forward. I'm now out of the home and I'm go off to college up east in Boston. And I'm skipping over a lot, but at the end of the day, I ended up marrying my college sweetheart a year after I graduated from college. So I was 23. And he was the wrong choice. I mean, I'm just going to leave it there. Well, no, I'm not going to leave it there. I'm going to say, because it's part of, obviously, the story as to why I do what I do. The reality is, it was very obvious that on paper, we were not aligned values and priorities wise. I was convinced at the time that because we loved each other, which is why in this book, How to Get Hitched and Stay Hitched, I have a chapter in there that's called Why Love Alone, or not why, sorry, Love Alone is Not Enough. And that stems from this experience, obviously, in part. I was convinced that love is all you need, right? If you love someone enough, you make it work. I mean, how many times do you hear this, right? From your own parents, from the culture. It's just, that's it. Love, 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 love. I think my ex was actually, I think we were very typical male and female at the time, in that his mind knew in a more practical way that it wasn't enough. And my romantic mind insisted that it was, because he was sort of pulling back, and it was like forward, back. You know, we were trying to sort of split up because he was from New York, I was from the Midwest, and we had a huge geography problem. And it was just messy, very messy, and it should not have been. I mean, that's part of the problem when you fall in love with somebody from a different part of the country. Unless one of you really wants to build a life in the other person's part of the country, which certainly happens for sure. It just wasn't our case. He was definitely Eastern. I mean, he was very Northeast, I should say, with his belief system, and I was very Midwest with mine. And that was really the crux of it at the end of the day. But there was no lack of love, right? We were very, very, very much in love. And we believed, or at least I did, and I must have convinced him, that would overpower the rest. And of course it didn't. And it fell apart. And that's one of the reasons why I try to warn other people not to do that. Specifically young women, since we do tend to be the romantic types. Anyway, so that marriage lasted 4 years, no kids. And then I eventually moved home. And 3 years later, I was married to my current husband, and we've been married for 23 years, have 2 children, and we're about to be, we are like empty nesters as of now. So that's sort of my trajectory, and hopefully that gives you a little window into why I'm here and why I feel so strongly about the things that I do, the things that I teach. That my experiences are so countercultural in that, at least my upbringing was, and then my having been married and divorced, no kids. That's another little subculture. There's actually a name for those folks, and that's called a starter marriage. I don't know when they named that or why, but it's folks who married 5 years or less and did not have children. If you Google the starter marriage, you'll find a lot of information on that. So I fall into that category, which is, not a huge portion of people do that. So I'd like something good to come out of that, please. Thank you. So yeah, between that, the love not being, love is not enough thing, and the having very countercultural messages from my parents growing up, mixed with seeing a marriage that did not, that struggled in a big way, and there was a lot of conflict despite their staying married. All of those things together, I guess, led me to where I am now, which, that's another thing. You grow and you change. So this whole idea that, I think I've spoken about this before, but I'll say it again. This idea that you're going to find yourself, find your life, do all of these things, and then get married, and this person's going to just mesh into this life you've created. as though you're done growing is just ridiculous. I mean, you never finish growing, and you're going to constantly be changing. So by that logic, you might as well just get married when you're younger, because you're going to constantly grow, and the idea is to grow together. So you never know what's going to happen. That's the other problem with living with people, this idea that you're going to test it and see if it's going to work. To be married to this person, that's also crazy, because there's no way of knowing how you're going to be tested down the road. It just doesn't work that way. Oh, I don't know. I just, as you can see, feel very strongly about all of this. And so that's why I do what I do. As far as my marriage today, my 23-year marriage, he and I came together when we met with a very strong understanding of how we thought and what we believed with respect to these subjects. And we are aligned on 150%. And that common mission is huge for us. It's just been a boon. And that doesn't mean that we're this perfect fit and everything goes great and I'm so lucky and don't I have a perfect marriage. It is nothing like that. We have as many problems as everybody listening. If you're married, all marriages have conflicts and problems. The issue isn't how do I avoid that? The issue is how do you move through that and stay intact in a healthy fashion? That's ultimately the goal. And who doesn't have that goal? Who when they're married doesn't ultimately want that? The issue really is, how are you going to get there? And can somebody please help, right? And that's why I do what I do. That's what the coaching is all about. My husband and I have struggled through and come out on the other side. It just bothers me very much that people are taught to think that there's this person out there that's just perfect for you. And once you find them, you're all good to go. No, there's definitely a person who's better suited for you than someone else, for sure. I mean, I can look back on my story that I just explained, and obviously my husband today is much better for me and a much better match than my first. But that doesn't mean that the marriage will succeed on its own accord because you found this perfect match. You found a better match, or you try to find a good match in the ways that are smart, the values, the priorities, similar backgrounds, where you're going, what your goals are, all of those things. But you're still going to struggle with problems, even with that. So you want to get that in place, yes, which I didn't have before. But I had other problems, or he and I have other problems that I didn't have with my first husband. And so when somebody comes along and thinks that they're going to, not take themselves with them into the next marriage and still have other, 9 out of 10 times you come out of one frying pan into another to some degree. You get a different set of crap, to deal with. And really at the end of the day, it's more about how are you going to deal with that crap? How are you going to deal with it? And that's why my biggest message to people is, and I keep coming back to this and thinking about it over and over every year I'm married. It's like, what are your views of marriage itself? What is your view of marriage as an institution? Because if you have the same view of this thing you've embarked upon together, you're much, much more likely to succeed than if one person thinks less of marriage than the other and that they can always get divorced. You're likely going to have that happen, right? You have to be on the same team about what it is you're doing together in order to propel forward. If someone's constantly pulling back because the mission's different or the mindset is different, then you're going to struggle, which is why it's also so important to look at people's parents' relationship when you do get married. If you're a product of divorce, which, by the way, my husband is, and I had no idea what that was going to. I didn't know anybody, actually. I knew people who were divorced, but I was never involved with anybody. I didn't even have any close friends whose parents were divorced, believe it or not. So this was totally new territory for me, and I'm completely unfamiliar with it. Or I mean, I was at the time. And if he were sitting here, he would tell you the truth about what his issues are as a result of that followed through into his adult life and, of course, into our relationship. In the same way that I have things from mine. It's just a different kind of thing. But so I'm not saying there's a way to, marry somebody whose background is great so you don't have any problems. Once again, it's just being aware of how different that background is with respect to what they want going forward for themselves in their own lives. And that comes back to their view of marriage and what the goal is, instead of just getting married because you love them, and you want to have kids. It's got to be bigger than that. It's got to be bigger than that. Without a mission, you're gonna stumble. So I hope that helps to sort of have this recorded, to just hear my story, which is not something I talk about very often, but I thought it would be helpful, especially as I'm going forward every week, to talk to you about this very important mission of mine this year with this book and its content. So I thank you all for listening. And until next time, remember, you can always contact me at Suzanne at 𝗬𝗲𝗏𝗏𝗏show.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week. And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to go to SuzanneVenker.com/podcast and click on Become a Patreon subscriber, where you get early access to the shows as well as other perks. This is what allows me to continue to bring you quality content commercial free. That is my number one goal, because you know what? Commercials suck. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week.